Welcome to the Lifeboat Hour with your host, Carolyn Baker.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost.
Thank you for joining us today on the new Lifeboat Hour. Every podcast of the new Lifeboat Hour is special, but today we're going to discuss an issue that every single person listening to my voice at this moment must stop and pay very close attention to, as if your life depended on it, because your life does depend on it. If you're a human being who eats food, and I haven't met too many human beings who don't eat, you absolutely must listen to this podcast and take action based on what you hear here today. In 2009, I moved to Boulder, Colorado after living in New Mexico for 11 years, followed by a year in Vermont. It was unspeakably delightful to return to the West, especially to the Front Range of Colorado, where I had lived much earlier in my life. And shortly before moving to Colorado, I had met Michael Brownlee and his partner, Lynette Marie Hanthorne, who at that time were in the process of establishing the transition movement in the United States. Alongside that project, Michael and Lynette were focusing on building a local food movement in Boulder, Colorado. And from approximately 2009 to the present moment, Michael Brownlee has been dedicating his life, his time, resources, and energy to not only raising consciousness about food security, but to teaching people how to develop food security in their local place, because abrupt climate change, global warming, and the extreme weather that ultimately creates climate catastrophe is guaranteed to put your food supply, my food supply, and the food supply of every living being on this planet in profound jeopardy. Michael and Lynette founded Local Food Shift Colorado, and several times yearly, Michael publishes a Local Food Shift magazine, which you can find at www.localfoodshift.pub, that's P-U-B, and will later this year release a book that every person listening to my voice must read, entitled The Local Food Revolution: How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times. In this book, The Local Food Revolution, Michael writes of an unholy alliance of transnational corporations, big ag, big food, and big pharma, empowered by big banking and big government, as well as big oil. Of this, he writes, quote, "Our industrial food system has become the equivalent of mountaintop removal coal mining, to the point that it is now an overwhelming contributor to the 6th mass extinction of species in planetary history, producing what Paul Ehrlich and his fellow researchers are now calling a global spasm of diversity loss, the worst planetary crisis in 60 million years," unquote. Michael also writes, quote, "We must recognize that the global industrial food system cannot be redeemed, for like the fossil fuel industry on which it depends, it is so deeply corrupt and corrupting, so morally and spiritually bankrupt, that its inevitable fate is entropic decline, or even widespread collapse. In fact, this global food system has become the greatest threat to humanity's being able to feed itself," unquote. I'm going to stop talking now, and we're all going to start listening to Michael Brownlee talk about the predicament in which we find ourselves around food and what we must do about that as soon as possible. Today, I'm privileged to have with me my friend, neighbor, and colleague here in Boulder, Colorado, Michael Brownlee. Michael, welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's an honor to be on the new Lifeboat Hour. I'm a great admirer of your work. And I just want to begin with, it's familiar to many of your listeners, but I want to begin with a very frank acknowledgement that we're in a terrible situation. on this planet today. We have unleashed the sixth great mass extinction of species on the planet, and humanity itself, of course, is on the endangered list. And at the least, we're in for a near-death experience as a species. Our civilization is essentially dying. And everywhere we see the signs of its breaking down. We see that collapse appears to be inevitable on multiple levels. And from a certain perspective, this leaves us with little hope for the future. But I'm beginning to see that where we're really at is an evolutionary threshold.
Right.
And while it's certainly possible that we're headed towards extinction or irreversible entropy, a deep study of evolution suggests another possibility, that we could actually begin to reverse this decline that we're seeing on the planet. We're learning from the process of evolution that cataclysm, and we're certainly entering into an age of cataclysm, is always followed by emergence. Life always goes on. Life always survives. So what we must do is learn how to align with that flow of evolution that we have been resisting as a species since the beginning of our civilization.
Well, you talk about the Anthropocene, and that's not a word that is strange to most people listening to this program. How do you see that Anthropocene happening right in this moment?
Well, the Anthropocene is unfolding in a way that, well, we're learning that we have now a geological impact, a permanent geological impact on our planet. And so what we've unleashed is a period of chaos, of conflict, of destruction, and increasing suffering. And this period of the Anthropocene, we've just begun this period, maybe, within the last couple of 100 years. Some say it began with the Industrial Revolution, mm-hmm. but it is likely to go on for millennia.
And you were about to tell us how we could align with some sort of evolutionary catalyst experience. So before you tell us how we could align, I'd like you to tell us how you think we got here.
Yeah. So these days we often hear it said that our food system is broken, that our economy is broken, and even that our democracy is broken. But what we're beginning to understand is that these are not broken. They've just been hijacked. They've been stolen from us, and we need to take them back now. This will require a revolution, a deep revolution. And fortunately, evolutionary catalysts are emerging everywhere on the planet to help make this possible. So the premise of my book is that the key leverage point for this deep revolution is taking back our food supply through a local food revolution. In other words, going through the process of localizing our food supply to the greatest extent possible in the shortest possible time. And I'm to the point now where I'm beginning to declare that this is the most important and most urgent social cause on our planet today. We're all dependent, as you mentioned, on this global industrial food system, which is controlled by what I like to call the unholy alliance. It's big ag, it's big food, it's big pharma, supported by big government and big banking, and all fueled by big oil. And this industrial food system has gotten to the point where it's now the largest and the most destructive industry in the world. And it's responsible for arguably at least half of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's caused much of the destruction of our environment. It's destroying human health and local economies. It's also been causing overpopulation and human overshoot. And this has all been done in the name of wealth and power. So we have, in effect, been colonized by this global industrial food system. And this has greatly accelerated since World War II. But it really began with the advent of what Daniel Quinn, the author of Ishmael, calls totalitarian agriculture, which began about 12,000 years ago. And what's so extraordinary to me is how successful all of this has been, to the point that today we are almost completely unconscious about our food supply. And, not coincidentally, we're equally unconscious about money, about our economy, our democracy, and even the disappearance of human freedom, which is vanishing before our eyes.
I just have to stop you there and say that what amazes me is, even among activists and people who are aware of near-term human extinction, the possibility of that, we are just not aware of how much of our lives depend on food, how precarious that is. Even if we grow our own food, most people are oblivious to this crisis.
Yes, and I think that when we dig into it, we'll discover that that's by design. Mm-hmm. That's why we say the food system is not broken. It is working extremely well. It is working exactly the way that it's been designed. So we've been along the way transformed into consumers.
Yes.
We even identify ourselves as consumers. And what that means, if you step back and look at it, is essentially we are being ranched. We are the resource, the very resource that the unholy alliance is mining and exploiting. And we're told these days that by mid-century, 80 to 90% of the human population will have no other choice but to live in crowded cities. And if we think about it, we could see cities as CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations.
Wow.
Where the unholy alliance can most efficiently exploit us. Mm-hmm. So it's time for us to wake up and reclaim our independence, our sovereignty, our democracy, and our freedom. And I say reclaim, but perhaps we're really in the process of claiming and establishing these things for the very first time in human history. And I think that's what the possibility is here.
So, Michael, before we talk about the doorway to this reclaiming, I'd like to stop for a moment and just thank everyone listening to the Lifeboat Hour, who's been listening to the new Lifeboat Hour for several weeks. As you all know, this podcast is free, but my guest and I spend several hours a week planning the program, and we'd like it very much if you toss a little support our way. On the Podbean website, where the podcast is linked, and on my website in the podcast section, you have the opportunity to become a patron of the new Lifeboat Hour by contributing $1 or more for each listen or download of the podcast, or to contribute a monthly amount. So if you listen regularly, a monthly contribution is a really good idea, or if you want to contribute one episode at a time, that's okay too. This week, I want to personally thank Deborah Y. and David L. for becoming patrons of the show. I really appreciate your support. And on the patron page, folks, you'll see the various rewards that are available to you for becoming a patron. For a contribution of $5 a month, I'll certainly mention your name on the podcast. And for a contribution of $25 or more, I'm happy to send you a signed copy of one of my books. So please keep up. Please help us keep up superb guests for the show and quality programming. We no longer have to depend on a radio station that is often going down and not able to really serve us. We're presenting independent quality programming so that you can rely on us weekly. And we want you to help us keep that happening on the new Lifeboat Hour. You can access the new Lifeboat Hour podcasts by going to my website at carolynbaker.net and clicking on podcasts. And also, I post the link to the podcast every Monday morning on Facebook. So today I'm speaking with Michael Brownlee, co-founder of Local Food Shift in Colorado, which you can find at www.localfoodshift.pub. And Michael is also the author of a book which will be released in October from North Atlantic Books entitled The Local Food Revolution: How Humanity Will Feed Itself in Uncertain Times. Today, we're talking about the dire crisis coming to all of us very soon in terms of food security and what we can start doing about mitigating this crisis right now. So before the promotional message about the new Lifeboat Hour, we were beginning to talk about the actions we must start taking now. And Michael, I'd like you to explain to us what the doorway through this crisis is and what we need to do right now.
Well, one of the realizations that I came to while working on this book is that the local food revolution is a doorway to the kind of healing and regeneration that is needed on the planet. And it's interesting that our dying civilization actually, with totalitarian agriculture, our civilization began with food. So it's appropriate that this healing and regeneration and restoration begin by radically shifting how we have come to feed ourselves, by creating localized regional food sheds. So food is, in fact, the basis of human civilization. And if we can begin organizing our communities around the project of feeding ourselves locally instead of being dependent on the unholy alliance, we will be rebuilding community, restoring our local economies, and rediscovering democracy. And we'll begin to reverse the damage that we've done to ourselves and to the planet. And the good news is that this local food revolution is already underway. And if we've got a couple of minutes, I'd like to talk about just touch on a couple of examples of things that are happening in Colorado.
Absolutely, go for it.
One of the really inspiring developments is taking place in the neighborhood of Westwood within the city of Denver. Westwood is a food desert. It is probably the most economically oppressed community in that city. Revision International is a small nonprofit that started the process of teaching people how to feed themselves in that neighborhood. And over the last 4 years, they have now gotten 400 families gardening at pretty significant scale, so that those 400 families are now providing a significant portion of their own food. And they're growing that throughout the Westwood neighborhood. And now those people in that community are organizing a community cooperative grocery store, which is a radical breakthrough in a food desert neighborhood. So that's one example. Up in Fort Collins, one of the great things that's holding local food back is land is almost impossible for farmers to get access to these days. Up in the Fort Collins area, farmland is going for about $30,000 an acre because of development around cities. So there was a young farming family, Nick Kuntz and his wife Katie, who over the last 7 years have grown a small but very successful farm. They needed to grow, but they could not buy land. They went to their community. Long story short, their community rallied formed a cooperative to buy 50-acre property, farmland that had been held by a family since the 1870s or so, conventional, traditional farming. But now that cooperative will own that land and be able to lease it to Nick and Katie for the rest of their lives. So this is a breakthrough that is replicable. It can be adopted throughout the country. And finally, I'll just mention, in the city of Denver, the mayor there, Michael Hancock, when he ran for office about 4 years ago, he suggested the idea of setting a goal for the city and county of Denver of 20% local food by 2020. It's one of the first cities to even suggest that possibility. And now it's not only an official goal of the city, but they're in the process of conducting community listening sessions throughout the city to get community's input on how this can actually be done. And I think by the end of next year, they will have that plan in place. They're a little behind schedule, but it's exciting that it's happened.
It's really exciting. I wasn't aware of it, and I really appreciate knowing that.
Well, that's one of the stories that we'll be talking about in Local Food Shift magazine. And the point that I want to make with these kinds of examples is that this local food revolution is not a revolt. It's not a rebellion. It's not a war against the unholy alliance and its global industrial food system. We're not trying to change that system. Instead, we're building a whole new, parallel, alternative, localized system. So, in other words, we're declaring our independence from the global industrial food system. We're decolonizing ourselves from all of that. We're resigning as consumers. We're taking back our food supply. This is radical, but it's necessary and it's urgent.
So in 2 months or so, we're going to be celebrating American independence in this country. And what I'm hearing today reminds me of that historic moment 240 years ago. Is it comparable to that watershed moment in history?
I think in evolutionary terms, it actually is, that the dynamics we're experiencing today, and this really sank into me in the last 6 months or so, that the dynamics that we're experiencing right now are very similar to what happened that led to the American Revolution 240 years ago this year. The oppression of the colonies at that time by the British Empire finally became unbearable. And people didn't know what to do. They were resigned essentially to their fate. But what it took was Thomas Paine's radical essay, Common Sense, to mobilize the people of the 13 colonies to declare their independence and to give birth to a new nation. So that same evolutionary impulse is now present today. And I think partly because that impulse was not completely fulfilled 240 years ago. You know, this nation was built on an economic system that is exploitive. It was built on slavery. You know, so human freedom did not ever quite come to the fore. But now we're similar to Thomas Paine's Common Sense. We're unleashing a declaration of local food independence that will give birth, we hope, to an independent local food system. And so we feel that localizing our food supply, and this is really what the book is about, must become our long-term meta project as we begin to navigate our way into a collapsing ecosystem throughout the world, a mass extinction of life, and a dying civilization. We need to reorganize our society around local food and farming. and get back to that divergence that happened 12,000 years ago and take the other path that we missed then. This is the pathway to rebirth and regeneration. This is our lifeboat, you could say. This is our ark through the cataclysm of the Anthropocene era.
Well, Michael, I have to tell you that it's a great relief not to hear you say that everything's going to be okay, because you and I know that it isn't going to be okay. We have to learn now how to navigate the Anthropocene, assuming that we survive it. And if we do, we absolutely must help not only ourselves, but each other. Now, you and I are both fans of physicist Brian Swimme and his work, and the geologian Thomas Berry, who talked about entering the Ecozoic era. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that era and how we can navigate the future.
It's interesting. We can talk about things being not okay. Well, things have not been okay for the last 12,000 years or so.
That's correct.
It's important for us to realize that. And,
yes.
And now we're heading into this time of reaping the disastrous consequences of the way that we've been living on the planet for the last 10,000, 12,000 years. So as we go into this, we need to realize that we're likely to see a very dramatic decline in human population as global warming becomes catastrophic everywhere. It will be a time, as I said, of great chaos and conflict and suffering. But through all of this, knowing that the evolutionary design of life is that life persists, life evolves, we must learn to navigate our way to the future through this Anthropocene and carry within us what it is that longs to emerge in us and through us, and allow ourselves to be guided by the very angels of evolution. And if we are successful many generations from now, the Anthropocene will ultimately give way to what Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry have called the Ecozoic era. And we could think of the Ecozoic like this. This is the time when what is left of humanity at that time will arrive finally at what we could call species adulthood. And we can begin then to fulfill our larger destiny in this vast universe. And if we're not successful at all that, we will become extinct or perhaps enslaved. So the stakes are very high. And this will require a generations long effort. It's the long revolution. In other words, years ago, we used to talk about the long emergency. Now we can talk about the long revolution.
Yes.
And, when I was a child, my parents once brought me up to Denver to visit a relative here. And arriving in Denver, I was overwhelmed by the sight of the towering Rocky Mountains rising in the west. But to my eyes, they looked like they were incredibly close, just within easy walking distance. So one morning I announced to my parents that I was going for a walk to the mountains and that I'd be back in an hour or so. And my father laughed and said, "Well, you better pack a lunch." So I think that we're headed into a long and difficult journey through the Anthropocene to the Ecozoic. And we'd better pack a lunch.
Wow.
We must learn to feed ourselves as locally as possible, starting immediately. That's the local food revolution. And it's not an option. It's an urgent necessity. But along the way, the good news is that I believe that we will rediscover that food is sacred. Food is our connection to life, and that the industrial food that we've essentially been force-fed for the last several decades is a major cause of our disconnection from the sacred and from the community of life and from each other. So we will learn to place the sacredness of food right at the heart of the rebirth and redemption and future of human civilization. So we like to say, welcome to the local food revolution. And if any of the listeners would like to receive information about an upcoming course on how to ignite the local food revolution in your community, I invite you to email me at michael@localfoodshift.com.
Would you say that one more time, Michael?
Sure. To get information about an upcoming course on how to ignite the local food revolution in your community, just email me at michael@localfoodshift.com.
Can you say just a little bit about that course? It sounds really fascinating.
Well, it is based upon the book on the local food revolution and how the principles outlined in that book can be applied in your community, and how we can all learn how to align with this evolutionary flow that once inspired the American Revolution and is now inspiring and igniting the local food revolution.
Well, thank you so much, Michael Brownlee, co-founder of Local Food Shift Colorado and author of the forthcoming book, The Local Food Revolution, How Humanity Will Feed Itself. Visit www.localfoodshift.pub to learn more about Michael's work, his book, and how you can get involved in this revolution, which is a matter of life and death for each of us and for everyone we love. So thank you all for joining us today on the new Lifeboat Hour. Join us again next week when my guest, the amazing Jennifer Hines, creator of the Arctic Methane Monster video presentation, is going to be back with us discussing the very latest in Arctic ice melt, extreme weather, and her latest research on climate chaos. Until next time, this is Carolyn Baker.
Thank you for joining us today. You can hear all podcasts and learn about Carolyn Baker's other works at www.carolynbaker.net. Her daily news digest is available by subscription and is delivered to your inbox 7 days per week with real news on economics, environment, geopolitics, civil liberties, and cultural issues, plus links to articles on inspiration and resilience. Come sail with us again next week on the Lifeboat Hour.